Hello and welcome to Noble Mind.
Noble Mind is a podcast exploring mindfulness, meditation, and psychology.
Hello, listeners. Alex and I like to talk a lot about compassion and mindfulness on this podcast. And coming up on Sunday, March 20th, we will be co-teaching the first of our 2022 Compassionate Meditation Workshop series. In this program, you'll learn about how self-compassion can support and enrich your meditation, mindfulness, or other contemplative practices. We'll spend some time practicing together and discuss practical applications of self-compassion both on and off the cushion. You can learn more and register at noblemindpodcast.com, and we hope to see you there.
In today's episode, we talk to Dr. Daniel Ellenberg about masculinities, traditional male role socialization, and its impact on men's ability to acknowledge vulnerability and show up in their full complexity in life and relationships. Daniel Ellenberg is an executive and leadership coach, organizational trainer, group facilitator, consultant, advisor, therapist, and researcher. He's president of Relationships That Work and directs Strength with Heart men's groups, training, and seminars. He's the immediate past president of the American Psychological Association's Division on Men and Masculinities.
If you're a fan of Noble Mind, be sure to leave us a great review here and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. We would also love to see you in our free Noble Mind Facebook community, where we are sharing bonus content, digging deeper into each episode, and discussing all of our favorite topics. To get all the details and join our email list, head on over to noblemindpodcast.com.
We are here with Dr. Daniel Ellenberg, a thought leader in men's psychology and past president of Society for the Psychological Study of Men and Masculinities. Welcome, Daniel.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Would you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and your work?
I was thinking about in terms of a tree, actually that the roots of the tree are not visible, and they began the tree a long, long time ago. And I think that my work is certainly informed by the roots of my own childhood. And that I think what happened for me was I looked around, and as a sensitive child, and I don't mean sensitive in a bad way, the way people say it these days, oh, you're so sensitive, like it's a criticism, or something. There's something wrong with you for being sensitive. You should be insensitive, right? But I was a sensitive child, and I would really see how people interacted with each other in a way that felt very inauthentic to me. Like I could always kind of feel something was going on inside that was very different from what came on the outside. And at the same time, I really longed for connection, which is, there are not more normal human pursuits and desires than feeling connected to other people. Obviously, we have social brains, we're tribal beings, we're group beings, and to feel discordant with the communication, hence not feeling a sense of psychological safety or a sense of common ground, led me onto some difficult paths. And I'm not going to go into my whole past about my path, but I think that at core, that desire to connect led me, throughout my life to do different things to attempt to connect. And I found that despite the difficulties I had and not really clear maps, in the world about how to create connections with people, I somehow tripped my way through. I don't mean with LSD tripped, but I stumbled my way through developing better connections with people. And that's part of what led me into, men's work, for myself personally and professionally.
You've been running men's groups for over 30 years, I believe.
March 14th will be 38, which is weird because I'm only 36 years old, so I'm not.
Started in utero.
So yeah, we brought you on because we're very interested in understanding your work about masculinity, and maybe you could just get us started by telling us about some of the ways that men are socialized and your own kind of understanding of this idea, this topic.
Over 30 years ago, when I was working on my PhD dissertation, it's a much longer story, but I used a sexual inventory to explore men's identification with the traditional male role, which has different aspects to it, like don't show weakness, anti-feminine, be really successful, never show doubt, always be confident, dominating, etc. Some of those aspects. And I used a sex role inventory, which was called the BEM sexual inventory, which really showed the degree to which males identified with the male role and females identified with the female role. This is not in the land of gender fluidity, by the way, back then. And what was designated as healthy was that males identify with the male sex role. So they did like to play with trucks and cars and be successful and all the different markers of what's considered traditional masculinity, and same for females, be nurturing and caring and, et cetera, like the things you associate with the female role. The thing that I think is really bizarre about it is that health, mental health, psychological health was designated the degree to which males identify with the male sex role, and same for females identifying with the female sex role. The supposition itself that is health is unhealthy,
right,
to begin with. And so I have come to really dislike the terms masculinity and femininity. So when people ask me, like, how can guys get in touch with their masculinity? I think it's a really bad question, because to some degree it's conceptual. Like, okay, I'm going to do something to feel my masculinity versus I'm going to express myself in the world. I'm going to bring my insides out. And if it happens to fall within like what's considered masculine or what's considered feminine, who cares? I mean, I'd like to see a world where we transcend these ideas about what's masculine and what's feminine, because essentially, I mean, I'm a humanist. I think that human beings have the same core traits. Now, they show up differently to some degree in males and females and gender fluid. That's fine. But they show up differently in each individual too. And so my attitude is like, well, what if we have room, for people to actually just be themselves, which is the whole idea of diversity, inclusion, and equity, which I think is frankly a limited concept. Just to say one thing about that, I always hear this everywhere. I work in organizations also. Diversity, equity, and I'm all for that, so it's not criticizing that. But what I don't see happening is corresponding trainings where people are really working with their own internal diversity, equity, and inclusion. Because it's very easy to have disowned aspects of ourselves that we project onto other people and hate them or judge them when we're not actually dealing with that corresponding part of ourselves. And that to me is the bigger work on this planet.
And given that our societies and economies are in flux, also the gender roles are in flux, and the act like a man box, perhaps there are more chances to escape it.
Absolutely.
Maybe you could share with us a little bit about what the Alex just referenced, this man box idea. Maybe tell us a little bit more about how you understand that.
Sure. I mean, it's a term, I think it was originally named by a guy named Tony Porter, who does a lot of work with men and helping them leave the man box. And the definition of the man box, is essentially that as little boys, we learn certain ways of being that it's acceptable within the box. Be dominating, be strong, show no doubt, for sure, never show vulnerability. It's a core part of it. Don't do anything that girls, women do. So you have to be in this box. And so any attitudes or behaviors that go outside of the box become suspect and actually can trigger anxiety and shame for boys and men. And so part of what this traditional masculinity ideology is upholding, quote, one's masculinity by staying in the man box and not threatening shame, blame, criticisms from outside. And I think part of the irony is that it's based on like the strong individual, and yet it's so conformist. I mean,
right.
I am a strong individual,
like everyone else.
It's kind of like that. There are demotivators out there, and one of them is on uniqueness, and it's a picture of snowflakes, and it says, remember, like, you are unique, just like everyone else.
Exactly.
What are the downsides for people who are not familiar with the topic of the man box?
If you look at the world in which we live, the context of that, the biggest word that shows up is complexity. The world is super complex, and it's increasingly complex. And so with globalism, with women in the workforce, with changing social constructs and circumstances, the world is very complex. And there's a tendency for human beings to want to feel safe, of course, because that's the first order of business, kind of safety versus threat. And so with increasing complexity in the world, the markers for security, the guardrails that we've held on to since, for maybe millennia, and certainly it's changed over the years, but they're really changing right now. Sex roles are changing. Everything is, social relationships are changing, gender fluidity. You can point to many different ways that the world is changing. And there's a tendency to want to go back to what's familiar. You sound like better the devil you know. And so what a lot of people do is they try to decrease the complexity of the world so that they can feel safe and secure. I think that if you look at global politics and U.S. politics right now, it's pretty clear that they're like, let's go back to the great past, make America great again. That's a whole other animal there. But the reality is, in terms of being resilient, which is how do you handle or how do you metabolize disruptive, unwanted changes, the most important thing is to actually increase the complexity of your mind to meet the complexity of the world, because that's the place where you have the greatest ability to intervene. Right? And I know that, in Noble Mind, or your work with mindfulness and self-compassion, that's the focus, right? That you have to develop yourself. And you can develop yourself in community and Sangha, which is the best, for sure. But you have to keep evolving, our minds to meet the world in which we live. And the traditional male role isn't doing that. It's kind of wedded to a past view. Boys, men, masculinity, having to be dominant, strong, never show vulnerability. And to me, the linchpin that holds the whole thing together is this denial of vulnerability, which is insane, really, because life is vulnerable. I mean, everywhere you look, there are vulnerabilities, from the fact that, there's death, and you think about the heavenly messengers, old age, disease, and death, they're all vulnerabilities. And the only way to overcome those vulnerabilities is to transcend to the point where you let go of all attachment. Now, that's no small matter, obviously, but it's like, how do you, be on that path about letting go, opening up to your core pro-social values while you're also at the same time metabolizing some real threats that can come in by choosing a different path.
Now, you make the point of how living in a society, we almost by osmosis adopt thoughts, values, feelings, attitudes, including those that are oppressive, sexist, racist, so on. And so first of all, it's a natural process, you make the point. But then we also can self-reject or reject parts of ourselves. And the male or gender models that we internalize, in turn, can cause us great difficulty in our personal life.
It's interesting, Alex. You said you almost by osmosis. And I would say, actually, it's not almost. I actually have a term I call it psychoosmosis, which is how we take in all of the messages through the permeable membranes of the brain. And once inside, they kind of coagulate and turn into characters. Those are part of how we develop kind of soft-wired characteristics. And those characteristics are internalized from the culture because we learn through modeling and imitation. And so the outer world takes residence in the inner world. And you think, oh, well, that's how I see things. And that's my belief. Really? Like you just created that belief? No. I mean, you have to internalize beliefs. I look at it, beliefs are hardwired. We have to have beliefs. as human beings. It's part of how the brain develops and scaffolds. Because essentially, like, if I don't believe that if I take a step, that ground is going to hold me, everything I do is going to be like new and potentially threatening because we're oriented towards survival. All right. So in internalizing these beliefs, we're finding a way to fit in with the tribe. Right. It's no accident that in rural America in general, it tends to be more conservative. In cities and more urban, America tends to be more, quote, liberal. I'm not trying to go into a big expose about politics here, but I think it's important to just recognize that as easy it is to judge people for their beliefs, and I'm not immune for sure about this, these little organisms, have found a way to fit in and survive in their tribe. Because if you think about the tribal brain, the social brain, the worst thing that can happen is you get excluded, from the tribe. And so part of why there's social anxiety and people judge themselves harshly for being like nervous about going to a party. I mean, even before COVID nervous, it's a different kind of nervous. Kind of like, will I be accepted? Will people like me? Because the opposite of that is it triggers a psychological threat of being excluded. And to be excluded from the tribe is a death sentence because you can't survive alone. And so it's part of what's confusing about being human is they can have this intense anxiety, and the purpose of anxiety is essentially to keep us alive, pay attention to potential threats, and feel like, I'm just going to a party. What's wrong with me? When actually there's unconscious, orientation. So this is threatening. This is dangerous. And that's part of why awareness is so important, because it's not a given fact in life. That's for sure.
So on the one hand, it can be confusing for people to identify with things that they have simply absorbed from their environment just by modeling and thinking that's actually their essential self.
Right. If you think about the need to fit in and the fact that fitting in means denial, of certain aspects, of yourself, that what happens, how do you deal with that which is unacceptable in the world? It may sound oxymoronic to call it an unconscious choice, but there are ways that the organism is protecting itself, most of which is not conscious, right? And so if there's a part, so for example, like I feel vulnerable and I go like, oh, I like you. Do you like me? Am I okay? Just the way little kids would be, but then they learn like, don't do that. That's so weak and lame and it's disgusting. It's beneath you. It's even feminine. To do something like that. We girls are like they're nervous about how but boys, you're totally secure, which is nonsense, of course. But so you have that part of you that feels vulnerable to social exclusion, to not feeling connected, but you can't express that in any way because it's shameful to feel that. So what happens is the organism makes sure that does not come into consciousness, because to come into consciousness is very, very threatening. So it's much better to be unaware of one's vulnerabilities than to be aware of them and then to be put in this position where like you actually potentially have to choose and have the courage to step forward in potentially threatening circumstances. So it makes sense, to be unconscious about things. And so what do you do with that? If your core parts are discordant with the culture, the context in which you're living. You have to go into armoring, defending against that and projecting, that onto other weak folks out there.
If you have men you're working with in your groups, I'm imagining, who are coming in with this sort of traditional male kind of socialization of, particularly not even being aware of vulnerability, let alone showing or expressing it. How do you kind of start people on that opening up journey a little bit? Like, where do people kind of begin to try to develop that awareness?
Well, context is king, or queen, or however you want to put it. Princess.
Supreme.
Supreme. There you go. And so within a context that encourages openness and transparency and give the messages that the expressions of who you are, beauty, warts, and all, is welcome. Here, as long as there's no physical violence, which I've never seen in the group, like speak your truth. Now, speak it responsibly. So we're basically kind of like, I teach certain like rules of engagement, speak from an I position, speak about your own experience, notice judgments come up, and start to really work with the complexity of who you are. And meaning that I think in general, guys learn this message that they're simple. Guys are simple. Women are complex. Mm-hmm. And you see these depictions of like the male brain and the female brain. The male brain is like beer, football, sex.
Right. Homer Simpson.
It's just like all this female brain, all these, you can only imagine what the female brain has in there. So guys learn this thing like I'm supposed to be simple, but actually inside they're not. And so awareness is, again, not simple. I like the term selves-awareness more than self-awareness. And because self-awareness implies oneself, and that's not the reality in there, because we have a complexity of different sub-personalized aspects, self-styles, whatever you want to call them. And so I'm always encouraging people to kind of look within and be transparent as possible. And so I look at helping people express their personal truth, not truth with a capital T, but meaning that the degree to which you can be aware of your various aspects, which has to do with self-awareness, which is intrapersonal. And then there's the interpersonal, which is the honesty. So the awareness is within and the honesty is interpersonal. And so the degree to which a person can be aware, like, for example, like, John, I notice that when I talk, you pretty consistently look away and don't look at me. And I'm telling myself a story, and as part of the teaching is that we have what I call an assumption warehouse in here that is immediately giving meaning to our perception of other people's behavior. We may be often wrong, but never in doubt, about the meaning we give. So part of this is really to start dislodging that. Actually, you may not be the best scientist of yourself, and other people. So part of this is to experiment, and people even call it like a lab, kind of a relationship lab. So John, I get the sense that, you don't like me, that you're looking away. Is there anything to that? And by the way, part of what I teach about is what I call the 1% rule, which is that in any perception, John, you don't like me, is a perception. There is some degree of truth and some degree of distortion. And even if there's 99% distortion, it's pretty rare that there's not a 1% truth. So asking like, what's the 1% truth is a way of circumventing the binary yes or no part of it. Because again, intention is very complex. Like someone says, you're trying to hurt me. No, I'm not. Yes, you are. No, I'm not. Yes, you are. Well, in the pie chart of intention, most of which is unconscious, there's probably a little sliver in there. Mm-hmm. Sure, no exact a pound of flesh. I'm certainly not beyond that.
So with the example of the group with John that's sort of perceiving that someone doesn't like him or that John doesn't like him, that it would be the person would respond and say, well, there's this 1% experience I'm having where I don't like this thing you're doing or saying or what you represent or something like that.
Right. And then, so Tony might say to John, well, it's not that I don't like you. It's just that there's a way that you, in my experience, go on too long. Mm-hmm. Like you made your point and then you're making the point a second time, a third time, a fourth time, a fifth time. I just start checking out.
Got it. Yeah.
And so there's a way that other awareness, how are you coming across to other people? That you don't see that very much out there in the literature, in the way people speak about awareness. It's always self-awareness. But you know what? You may be aware of certain parts of yourself, but you're not necessarily aware of how other people, are perceiving you. And so to be in a context where you actually get feedback from other people is super useful. I can tell you I'm a much more evolved person because the ways I've been devolved have been pointed out to me on more than one occasion, I might add.
At least twice.
Right, I just got it the second time. changed everything. Been perfect ever since.
Well, I like what you were saying a little bit back about encouraging people to be authentic as opposed to trying to be masculine or be feminine, whatever that means to them. That feels more freeing and doable and relaxed in some way. Yeah. I'm also kind of having another thought at the same time, though, which is that, like, I sense that, like, there's this desire to be gendered, right? There's a desire to be a man or to be a woman or to show up in a gendered way. I don't know if you have a thought related to that. It just feels like there's something that feels like a jam up in my brain as I try to put those two things next to each other.
God, kid, I want to do my very best to help unclog that jam. Totally understand what you're saying. I think it's part of the complexity, paradox of life. I mean, I'm a man and I want to be seen as a man, and that's certainly my orientation, in life. And certainly I understand that people want to be seen for their gendered selves. I absolutely get it. My point here is that just shows up naturally. If you're being yourself, you don't have to work for that. There's a way that, if I'm trying to be masculine, I'm somehow outside of myself, and I'm trying to sculpt myself into some box, or triangle or circle or something, that where I'm thinking, am I being successful being masculine? And so, like, for example, you hear quite a lot about, like, guys need to get in touch with their feminine sides, right? I think that's terrible branding. Terrible. And as someone who is a very emotional man, and I'm perfectly fine with crying, I'm being moved, and I will express vulnerabilities as they come up. I don't have the kind of shame I used to about, like, coming out, just like, that's me and beauty warts and all. I don't need to be someone other than I am, usually. And there's a part of me that says, yes, you should be different than you are. You should be different. But I'm aware of that part. And so I can look at that part versus from that part. And so that's part of the kind of disidentification with these aspects. But so when I'm crying or something, I never think like I'm being in touch with my feminine side. I'm being in touch with it with a softer, more vulnerable, more open part of myself that's feeling something deeply. But if I have a conceptual, this is my feminine side, I'm further away from the experience, of myself. Now, so I think it's perfectly fine for people, like, for, women love to put on makeup, many, and look feminine and pretty, as women, and that's perfectly fine. But do you need to try to be a woman? I'm trying to, rather than I'm actually expressing what feels right from the inside, being authenticity. That feels like an expression of myself from the inside, and I'm going to express that on the outside. And that's congruence. And authenticity is about congruence, essentially. That your inner matches your outer.
Could you share about your Strength with Heart programs and how self-compassion and mindfulness might play into this evolution?
I would say, first of all, self-compassion and mindfulness needs to play into everything that we think and do and how we behave. That's certainly a core belief I have. But in terms of the Strength with Heart, I've really been looking at, speaking of masculinity, really an emerging model of being men or male identified people, these days. And there's been an old view, and this is part of the, the dichotomy that, men are strong, our men should be strong, women are heartful, right? And so women hold the relationships, the hearth, men, go out in the fields and they go hunt and they go get prey and they protect them, and so there's been this belief that you're either strong and dominating. I would say strong, strength with low heart or no heart, or you're not strong and you're heartful, or like more feminine. You can't get shit done. You're just kind of like, I'm a nice guy. I'm ineffectual. I don't have boundaries. You can just walk all over me, or you're taken prisoners, which is a really extreme view of it. And so I see strength with heart as a blending, and the blending of strength and heart shows up in a way that's very different from either of those, meaning that you can be pro-social values, compassion, mindfulness, generosity, care, etc. And you can have boundaries, and you can have desires, you can have goals that you really go for. You don't step on people or push them aside or be nasty, pro-social, but you're going for what feels really important for you at the same time. And so I see strength with heart as a way that guys don't have to quote, prove their masculinity, which is part of the strength with no heart, mentality. But you can be heartful as a man, and that doesn't mean in any way that you are feminine. There it is again. Like somehow, you're moved by something. I don't want someone to see me cry, or I only cry with commercials. At commercials, home. There's so many guys, they never cry in front of other people, but they'll cry at a movie, or if a football player loses a game, and they're devastated, they'll have a towel over their head, on the sideline with their head down, don't see them cry. But it's so ironic when you think about it, because there's cortisol in tears, right? And so crying is actually one of nature's ways of de-stressing you, because cortisol is a stress hormone, right? So it's a natural process to cry. And when you learn these, you're supposed to be strong but not heartful, and heartful being vulnerable, you lose access to the kind of the psychobiological processes that lead toward health. How ironic. And so in the Strength with Heart programs, we're really trying to give guys permission and encouragement to show up, again, beauty, warts and all, and in relationship, by having people say, like, one of the exercises I might use is this guy is feeling shame about some aspect of himself, and they have him, and this is a little bit more before COVID, when we're actually meeting in person more, choose another man in the group, sit in front of him, and I'll give him words, and I say, you can use these words or change the words, but see how afraid I am at times to really show myself or to connect. And will you be with me, in this process? Inevitably, the other guy will say, yes, absolutely. And there's this moment, of intimacy. And I say intimacy not in sexuality, but in the phonetic of into me see.
Mm-hmm.
That you're allowing others to see into you. And that's part of the healing. It's like, I've had this part of me that's felt so shameful. And, you think about shame, which means to cover, and you want to hide that, part of yourself, which leads it to be more shadowy, and it leads it to have more power in the unconscious. I'm actually bringing this part out and revealing this to you. And in the acceptance and in the relationship, there's a healing that begins to take place from those early childhood roots, that have led to the development of that type of schema or pattern in the first place.
Yeah, I'm having a thought about how there's a role that other people, women, play in this whole game as well. Maybe you have some thoughts for folks who are women about, I don't know, helping the men or supporting the men in their lives, or ways that we might inadvertently contribute to some of these difficulties and keeping men in the man box.
The most important thing to me is for women to do their own self-work in this and let go of their own templates. I mean, you think about, the culture as the air we breathe and the water we drink, that leads to psychoosmosis, as I was talking later. It's not like, there's no way to be immune completely from the cultural messages that your growing brain would naturally internalize. And so these ideas about traditional masculinity that boys internalize, well, guess what?
Mm-hmm.
So do girls. And so, women a lot of times these days, and for actually some decades, said, I want a guy who's going to share his his emotions, with me. But it turns out that when some guys have shared those emotions, like these deep insecurities and doubts, waverings there, there are a good amount of women who get turned off by that. It's like, oh my God, they're actually not really a strong man. They're not this, even though I thought I wanted that, but I want a guy who's got a stiff upper lip. And so, their own kind of evolution about what do you, really want as a woman, recognizing that underneath every super confident man is a guy who has a bunch of doubts. And having worked with a lot of male leaders and guys who are seen as, really confident, secure, and smart and successful and stuff, inside in the complexity of who they are, there are aspects of themselves, parts of themselves that are more dubious about that. And so for women to be open to that and recognize the part of themselves that wants to be saved, the damsel in distress. And again, I'm not saying this is true for all women, and so I don't want this to be taken out of context. I'm just talking about kind of larger, kind of archetypal themes that, most of us fall prey to in some way or other. So that self-work, I think, is really important. And to some degree, also developing, for women, their own, aspects that have typically been considered masculine. Having boundaries, being clear, being direct, going for what you want, speaking your truth, your sword, so to speak. But the sword without the chalice, is what leads to the kind of strength with no heart. The chalice without the sword is, the low strength and heart, but it's for all of us to integrate our different aspects. I think that that's part of the complexity we each need to deal with individually. And then how do we support, that complexity in each other and have room for, shadowy thoughts.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I'm thinking if I'm socialized as a woman to, sacrifice myself for my relationships and for other people and to be sort of boundaryless and all of that. And then, my male partner shows up being very complex and vulnerable, then it's going to be hard for me to say, that's too much for me today, or like, let me help, it's going to be very difficult to negotiate that, and to really show up for your partner while also showing up for yourself at the same time. If you haven't, as you're saying, done that self-work to learn how to manage your boundaries. And
I think complexity can be super helpful in this regard. So for example, it's very different saying, I don't really like when you show up with all these doubts. Okay. That's a very different statement than I notice that there's a part of me that kind of goes into some judgment, about that. I'm aware of that. I don't, there's another part of me who really doesn't want that. And I'm recognizing that I'm, prisoner to my own kind of socialization at times. But I want to bring this out so I don't have to kind of, hide it and we can work with it. And then if the guy goes, well, that really pisses me off, and here you say you want, and then, a woman can then say like, okay, well, I notice getting defensive, right now. I'm trying, if you don't want an open relationship, and I don't mean open sexually with other people, it's not open relationships, but like, if you don't want me to be, open all of my different selves, then this may not work, for starters, but I'm committed to it working. But I want you to really expand and hear that. What's going on with you? That gets so triggered around that. I mean, this level of complexity in relationship, I think, is what we're moving into, but we're very far from it as a species. But I think it's important because I know for me, having, I think, really embraced complexity, like there's a part of me that hates people. Screw people. I'm tired of dealing with people. I can't stand you have an issue and, oh my God, leave me alone. Let me just sit somewhere on the top of a hill and not relate to anyone. Now, I would feel shame, in the past. I felt a little something saying that here on a podcast. But I also know that that's not all of me. It's part of me that loves people. I want to connect. I really care. And that's a big part of me. And that doesn't mean that part doesn't get frustrated and get judgmental, because to the degree to which I can look at that part and disidentify, then I'm not wedded to it. Like, that's my core identity. And that's part of the problem of being human. These things, when a mood shows up, it usurps everything. And it feels like that's who you are. And then you have to hide that rather than accept and embrace it. It's a part of me, and it doesn't have to dominate. I have more choice.
Seems like this is where those mindfulness practices might also be extremely helpful, because you maybe begin to be more aware that you're getting kind of hijacked by this one piece or part.
Exactly.
I wonder if this would be a good time, since we're talking a little bit about relationships and couples, to mention your Relationships That Work program and tell us a little bit about that.
For sure. So my wife and I, and some colleagues that we work with sometimes, have two different websites, and they're related, but they're to some degree different. We have relationshipsthatwork.com, which is really about personal relationships, couples, people who come in for, quote, therapy. So we're both licensed therapists. And then we have rewireleadership.com. It deals with organizational, leaders and organizational effectiveness. In both of these, we're always dealing with mindset. Essentially, mindset is what rules the planet. The mind is its own place, according to John Milton, and in itself can create a heaven of hell or a hell of heaven. And so we're really working with, on the personal side, couples, be they heterosexual, homosexual, whatever, that we're dealing with how to create more intimacy, intimacy, and teach basic kind of communication skills there, while also dealing with self-regulation, because communication skills alone don't work. Because essentially when people get hijacked, those go out the window and the old patterns come to the fore. My focus just generally in life is around love and connection. And I want to deal with everything that gets in the way of that. And so all of these different practices, all of these mindsets, my whole orientation is really around how to create an open space for love and connection. It turns out that that's not so simple. So all of these different practices, I think, are super important. But the intent for love and connection is super important, and recognizing the things that get in the way, these different aspects. And I know for me, one of the core questions I've been asking myself is, would I rather be wronged or free? By freedom is another core value for me. Because it's very easy, that person did that, or the Republicans did this. I have a term, I call it mumble fucking. Like mumbling. So I'm oriented in my own personal evolution to overcoming mumble fucking, and really, really increasing a sense of freedom by letting go of reacting to all of the different things that can trigger, certain parts of myself, which is all, obviously part of mindfulness, and self-compassion practice. So all of my work kind of not transcends, but it includes, this territory.
Sort of aware of how kind of tragic it is that as you were saying, that love and connection is the sort of guiding mission for you, and then sort of trying to address all these many things that get in the way, and just how tragic it is that this gender socialization we receive ends up becoming an obstacle to really connecting with each other.
That's right.
It's also intriguing how you integrate sort of both the individual level difficulties people have because of gender socialization and the global level, whole systemic. That's really precious to draw those links.
As the past president of my APA, American Psychological Association Division on Men and Masculinities, I had a meeting with several other divisional presidents in APA, with the CEO of APA, and the president of APA, around how divisions could help kind of collaborate more with each other and with APA leadership as a whole. And APA has different kind of social initiatives, and one of them is on climate change. And I raised in this meeting with probably like about 5 or 6 divisional presidents and a couple other people, including the CEO and the president of APA, I raised about the relationship between men, masculinity, and climate change. And I can tell the example of these two women who were in a cartoon, and it said underneath, they're in a bank, and it said, I love a man with a large fossil fuel imprint. And just thinking about the whole theme of domination, forget about Gaia, just extract as much as possible from the world, take no prisoners, compete, and how compete for resources, and how that's led us, to where we are. And the CEO said, I never thought of that. I never thought about masculinity, traditional masculinity, as in any way related to climate change and some of the resistance to that. And so I do think that there are ways that traditional masculinity is kind of like the water to the fish. We don't notice that we're swimming in it, but it's everywhere. It's just invisible.
Thank you so much for your time today. This has been great. Where can people learn more from you online?
Well, you can look at rewireleadership.com. A lot of information on that. You can actually resource the workshop that Rick and I are doing at the end of March on our events page on that, as well as you can go to Rick Hansen website and get on from there. Relationships that work, that work.com. And then there's Strength with Heart, which is about my men's work, .com, as well as you can email me at Daniel@rewireleadership or Daniel@relationships that work. Both fine. So, hey, it's been great being with the two of you. I've appreciated your openness and your true curiosity and willingness to engage in, I think, some very important topics. And I acknowledge you for what you're doing on your website. Great stuff. We need a lot more nobility these days. That's for sure.
Right. Strength and heart together.
Exactly.
Thanks so much.
Many thanks.
Thanks for listening today.
If you enjoyed this episode, we hope you'll hit subscribe, leave us a great rating or review, and spread the word. You can also go to noblemindpodcast.com to join our email list. You'll get a weekly behind-the-scenes message, news, announcements, and other special goodies we come up with just for you. Thanks for listening, and bye for now.